Before the idea of quarantine, there was a simpler concept. It was the idea of separation. People in the Middle Ages didn't understand germs, they didn't know about viruses or bacteria, but they understood that sickness could pass from one person to another. They saw it happen. This understanding wasn't scientific. It was based on observation and fear. The most visible example was leprosy. Leprosy was a terrifying disease. It disfigured the body, causing sores and nerve damage. People believed it was highly contagious. They also saw it as a mark of divine punishment, a physical sign of a spiritual stain. A person with leprosy, a leper, was considered unclean in every sense. Society's response was total exclusion. A leper had to leave their home and family. They were declared legally dead. Their inheritance was passed on to their heirs. They underwent a ceremony much like a funeral mass. The priest would throw a shovelful of dirt on their feet, saying, "Be dead to the world, but alive again to God." After this, they were outsiders. They were forced to live in special colonies outside the city walls called leprosaria. When they had to enter a town, perhaps to beg for food, they were required to announce their presence. They might wear a special cloak or carry a bell or a clapper. The sound warned healthy people to get out of the way. You could not touch a leper. You could not share a meal with them. You were not even supposed to breathe the same air if you stood upwind. This was a form of social and physical isolation. It wasn't quarantine in the modern sense. It wasn't for a set period of time. It was a life sentence. But it was built on the same basic principle: to protect the healthy, you must separate the sick. For most other diseases, however, this level of separation was not practical or even considered. Sickness was a part of life. People believed disease was caused by many things. One of the most popular theories was miasma. And miasma was bad air. People thought that foul smells from rotting organic matter, like swamps or garbage, could carry disease. This bad air could poison the body and cause illness. So, if a plague hit a town, a common response was to burn fragrant herbs like rosemary or carry pouches of flowers called posies. The idea was to create a bubble of good air around yourself to ward off the bad. It was a logical idea based on what they could sense. The stink of death and decay was everywhere during an epidemic, so it made sense to think the smell itself was the killer. Another powerful belief was that disease was an act of God. It was a punishment for sin. An entire city might be seen as sinful, so God sent a plague to cleanse it. The only cure, then, was spiritual. People would pray, fast, and hold religious processions. They would try to appease an angry God. Some groups, known as flagellants, would travel from town to town, whipping themselves in public displays of penance. They hoped their suffering would convince God to lift the plague. So you had these coexisting ideas. Disease came from God's wrath. It came from bad air. And sometimes it came from other sick people. But these ideas were not organized into a public health system. Responses were often chaotic and personal. If you were rich, you could simply flee. When plague arrived in a city, the wealthy would pack up and go to their country estates, leaving the poor to face the sickness. This was a personal form of isolation, a quarantine for the privileged. But for the city authorities, there were few tools. They might try to clean the streets to fight the miasma. They might organize prayers to appease God. They might try to stop people from other known infected towns from entering their gates. But these measures were inconsistent. There was no standard procedure. There was no medical authority telling them what to do. The sick were generally cared for at home by their families or by religious orders. This meant the disease spread easily within households and neighborhoods. The idea of isolating the sick to protect the community was not a state-enforced policy for common illnesses. It was reserved for the most dreaded and visible disease, leprosy. That was the world before the Great Catastrophe. It was a world of prayer, bad air, and a profound personal fear of the sick. It was a world about to be broken by a plague so vast it would force a new way of thinking. Everything changed in the middle of the 14th century. A disease of unimaginable horror swept out of the East. It traveled along the trade routes, carried on ships, and in the caravans of merchants. It was the bubonic plague, but people at the time called it the Great Pestilence or the Great Dying. Later, it would be known as the Black Death. Its arrival in Europe was swift and brutal. In 1347, Genoese trading ships returning from the Black Sea port of Caffa docked in Messina, Sicily. The townspeople were shocked by what they found. Most of the sailors on board were already dead or dying. They had high fevers, were delirious, and had strange black swellings in their armpits and groins. These swellings, called buboes, were filled with pus and gave the disease its name. The Sicilian authorities ordered the death ships out of the harbor, but it was too late. The disease was already on shore. It wasn't carried by people alone, it was carried by the fleas on the rats that were always present on ships and in medieval cities. The fleas were the vector, but no one knew that. All they knew was that after the ships arrived, people in the port started dying. From Sicily, the plague spread with terrifying speed. It moved to the Italian mainland. It traveled north into France, Spain, and England. It went east into Germany and Scandinavia. Within 5 years, it had engulfed almost all of Europe. The scale of the death was something no one had ever experienced. It wasn't like a normal sickness that took the very old or the very young. The Black Death killed everyone. Strong men, healthy women, and children all died, often within days of the first symptoms appearing. Entire families were wiped out. In some towns and villages, more than half the population died. In others, there was no one left at all. Chroniclers of the time struggled to describe the horror. They wrote of cities where the streets were littered with the dead, with no one left to bury them. Mass graves were dug, huge pits where bodies were layered like lasagna. Society began to break down. Doctors who tried to help caught the plague and died. Priests who gave last rites to the sick also died. This left people without medical care and without, spiritual comfort at the moment of their death. Fear destroyed social bonds. Parents abandoned their sick children. Husbands and wives left each other to die alone. The normal rules of life disappeared. People lived in constant terror, knowing that a slight fever or a small ache could be the first sign of their own agonizing end. The old ideas about disease were completely inadequate. Praying didn't seem to work. The plague killed the pious and the sinner alike. The flagellants who whipped themselves to atone for humanity's sins often just spread the disease from town to town. The miasma theory led people to burn fires and ring church bells, hoping the smoke and the noise would clear the bad air, but the dying continued. The blame turned outward. Minorities, especially Jewish communities, were often accused of poisoning wells and deliberately spreading the disease. This led to horrific massacres, but it did nothing to stop the plague. The only thing that seemed to work was running away. Those who could fled the crowded, filthy cities for the countryside. This personal flight was a lesson. It showed that distance from the sick could mean survival. But this was an individual solution, not a public one. And for the cities and states that couldn't run away, the disaster forced them to confront a hard truth. Their old ways had failed. Prayer was not enough. Burning herbs was not enough. They were facing an enemy that seemed unstoppable, and they needed a new weapon. This desperation created an opening for a new idea. It was an idea based not on theology or superstition, but on raw, practical observation. They noticed that the disease seemed to arrive with ships and travelers. They saw that it took a certain amount of time for a person to get sick after being exposed. They didn't know why, but they saw the pattern. The sickness traveled and had an incubation period. And if you could stop the travelers, if you could make them wait, maybe you could stop the sickness from entering your city. It was out of this catastrophic failure of old systems, out of the stench of death and the breakdown of society, that the first organized, state-sponsored attempts to control a disease were born. The idea of quarantine was about to emerge from the ashes of the Black Death. The new idea did not appear overnight. It grew slowly, piece by piece, in the busy port cities of the Mediterranean. These cities, like Venice, Genoa, and Ragusa, were the gateways for trade with the East. They were also the gateways for the plague. Their wealth depended on the constant flow of ships, goods, and people. But this very flow brought death to their doorstep. They were caught in a terrible dilemma. If they closed their ports completely, their economies would collapse. If they left them open, their populations would be wiped out. They needed a middle way. The city of Ragusa, now Dubrovnik in Croatia, was one of the first to act systematically. In 1377, its ruling council issued a new law. Any ship coming from a plague-ridden area would not be allowed to enter the city. Instead, the ship and everyone on board had to go to a nearby island. There they had to stay for 30 days. This period was called a Trentino. During this time, they had to prove they were healthy. If anyone got sick, the clock would restart. Only after 30 days with no new sickness were they allowed to come ashore and conduct their business. This was a radical step. It wasn't just a suggestion, it was a law enforced by the state. It was not based on prayer or miasma, it was based on the observation that the disease had a latency period. The city leaders of Ragusa didn't know what caused the plague, but they had figured out that if people from an infected place were kept separate for a while, the risk to the city was reduced. They were creating a sanitary barrier in time and space. Other cities saw what Ragusa was doing and adopted similar practices. The most influential was Venice. As a major maritime power, Venice was constantly threatened by plague arriving on its ships. In the early 15th century, the Venetians took the Ragusan idea and expanded on it. They extended the isolation period from 30 days to 40. This 40-day period was called a quarantina in Italian, from the word quaranta, meaning 40. This is where we get our word quarantine. Why 40 days? The reason is not entirely clear. It might have had a practical basis. Perhaps they found that 30 days was not quite long enough, and some cases of plague appeared after that period. 40 days provided a wider margin of safety, but there was likely a symbolic reason as well. The number 40 has a powerful resonance in Christian tradition. It rained for 40 days and 40 nights during the Great Flood. And Moses spent 40 days on Mount Sinai. Jesus fasted for 40 days in the desert. The 40-day period suggested a time of purification, trial, and cleansing. For medieval society, this blend of practical observation and religious symbolism made perfect sense. To manage this new system, Venice created a new government body, the Magistrato alla Sanità, or Health Magistracy. This was one of the first permanent public health boards in the world. Its job was to oversee all matters of public health, especially the enforcement of quarantine. They had their own guards and officials, they could stop ships, inspect cargo, and confine people. Venice also pioneered the lazaretto. Instead of just anchoring ships at an isolated island, they built a dedicated quarantine station. The first one was established in 1423 on an island in the Venetian lagoon called Santa Maria di Nazareth. The name was soon shortened to Nazaretto, which eventually became Lazaretto. This was not a hospital for treating the sick, it was a holding facility for people and goods in quarantine. It had separate buildings for passengers and crew, and large warehouses for cargo. Ships would unload their goods, which were then aired out and exposed to the sun and wind, in an attempt to disinfect them. People would live in the Spartan quarters for their 40 days, watched over by guards to make sure no one left. If someone did get sick, they were moved to a separate building, a lazaretto sporco, or dirty lazaretto, to die or recover, while everyone else's 40-day count started again. Another key innovation was the Bill of Health. This was an official document issued by a city, certifying the health status of the ship and its port of origin. A ship arriving in Venice from a port considered free of plague would have a clean bill of health and might face a shorter quarantine or none at all. A ship from a known infected area would have a full bill of health and would be subjected to the full 40-day quarantine without question. This system of paperwork, bureaucracy, and physical infrastructure was the beginning of modern public health. It was an attempt by the state to control disease on a massive scale. It was harsh, expensive, and often brutal, but it was a rational response to a deadly threat. Life under quarantine was a miserable experience. It was a combination of extreme boredom, constant anxiety, and physical discomfort. For sailors, merchants, and passengers arriving at a port like Venice, the sight of the Lazaretto Island was a grim one. It meant their journey was not over. A 40-day prison sentence was about to begin. When a ship was ordered into quarantine, it was anchored offshore near the Lazaretto. Health officials would come aboard, often keeping a safe distance. They would inspect the crew and passengers for any signs of illness. They would check the ship's cargo and its bill of health. If everything was deemed suspicious, everyone and everything had to be moved to the island. The lazaretto itself was a stark, functional place. It was usually a walled compound with simple stone buildings. There were long dormitories for the common sailors and passengers, and perhaps some small private rooms for wealthy merchants who could pay for them. The conditions were basic. Food was delivered, but it was often poor quality. Water was rationed. There was little to do but wait. People would try to pass the time by gambling, talking, or mending clothes. But always, there was the fear. Every cough, every headache, every small ache was a potential death sentence. People watched each other nervously. If one person fell ill with a fever, a wave of panic would sweep through the compound. The guards would be called, the sick person would be dragged away to the dirty section of the lazaretto, and the 40-day clock would be reset for everyone else. It was a tense psychological ordeal. Goods were also quarantined. This was a huge logistical challenge. Everything had to be unloaded from the ship. Textiles like cotton, wool, and silk were considered especially dangerous, as it was believed they could trap and hold the plague seeds or miasma. These bales of cloth would be hung up on lines in large, airy warehouses. They were repeatedly turned and beaten to release any trapped bad air. Letters and documents were considered suspect, too. They would be handled with tongs, dipped in vinegar, or perfumed, by holding them over smoke from burning sulfur or straw. The idea was to purify them before they could be delivered into the city. This system was run with strict discipline. The lazaretto was patrolled by guards. Anyone trying to escape would be severely punished, sometimes even executed. Communication with the outside world was forbidden. Families waiting in the city could only get news of their loved ones on the island through official channels. The economic cost was enormous. A merchant's capital was tied up for 40 extra days. The ship's crew had to be paid and fed. The goods might spoil or be damaged during the rough disinfection process. This led to constant attempts to cheat the system. Captains would lie about their last port of call to get a clean bill of health. Merchants would try to bribe health officials. People would attempt to smuggle small, valuable goods ashore. But the health magistrates were powerful, and the penalties for being caught were severe. Our quarantine was not just for seaports. The same principles were applied on land. If a city had an outbreak of plague, neighboring towns and states would set up a cordon sanitaire, a sanitary cordon. This was a guarded perimeter around the infected city. No one was allowed in or out. Soldiers would patrol the roads, with orders to shoot anyone who tried to cross. This effectively turned an entire city into a giant lazaretto. Inside, life was a nightmare. The healthy were trapped with the sick. The city gates were locked. Trade stopped. Food supplies dwindled. People were ordered to stay in their homes. Officials would walk the streets, marking the doors of infected houses with a large cross. The inhabitants of that house were sealed inside, sometimes with a guard posted outside, to wait for the disease to run its course. Often, the entire family would perish inside. These practices were born of desperation. They were a blunt instrument. They caused immense suffering and economic hardship. They turned communities into prisons and neighbors into potential threats. But they were also a sign that people were no longer just passively accepting their fate. They were fighting back. They were using the tools they had, observation, authority, and organization, to try to build a wall against the unseen enemy. Life under quarantine was a life in suspension, a brutal pause between the danger of the outside world and the safety of the city. It was the price of survival in a world haunted by plague. Did medieval quarantine actually work? The answer is complicated. It did not defeat the plague. The Black Death was followed by recurring waves of plague that swept across Europe for the next 300 years. The system had many weaknesses. It was not uniformly enforced. A city like Venice might have a strict quarantine system, but a smaller port nearby might be more lax, allowing the disease to slip through. The smuggling and corruption were constant problems. People were desperate, and they took risks. And fundamentally, their understanding of the disease was wrong. They were fighting miasma, or plague seeds, not a bacterium carried by fleas. So, their methods were imperfect. Airing out textiles for 40 days probably did little to kill the bacteria. But some of their practices worked by accident. Isolating people for 40 days worked because the incubation period for bubonic plague is only a few days. If no one got sick in 40 days, it was a very good sign that no one on board was infected. Keeping rats from coming ashore with the cargo and crew, even if that wasn't the primary intention, would have helped. The cordon sanitaire, as brutal as it was, did limit the geographic spread of an outbreak. So, while it couldn't stop the plague entirely, quarantine did help to contain outbreaks and slow their transmission. It gave cities a way to manage the risk and to feel like they were doing something, which was psychologically important. The adoption of quarantine practices was slow and uneven. It started in the Mediterranean port cities, where the threat was constant. It took decades, even centuries, for the idea to spread north. Northern European countries were often skeptical at first, viewing it as a costly and inconvenient practice. But as repeated plague waves hit them, they too began to see its value. England established its first quarantine laws in the 17th century, long after Venice and Ragusa. Over time, the lazaretto, the bill of health, and the sanitary cordon became standard tools in the public health arsenal of every European state. The real legacy of medieval quarantine is not that it was a perfect medical solution. Its legacy is that it fundamentally changed the relationship between the state, the individual, and disease. Before the Black Death, health was largely a private matter. With the birth of quarantine, health became a public concern. For the first time, governments took on the authority to detain people who were not accused of any crime, to seize their property, and to restrict their freedom of movement, all in the name of protecting the community. This was a massive expansion of state power. The health magistrates of Venice were bureaucrats, not doctors, and they wielded immense authority. This laid the groundwork for modern public health. The idea that a government has the responsibility and the right to implement measures to stop the spread of disease comes directly from these medieval practices. The data they collected, tracking the movement of ships, noting where outbreaks were happening, recording mortality rates, was a primitive form of epidemiology. They were trying to understand the disease not just as a single case, but as a population-level phenomenon. Of course, the science has changed completely. We now understand germ theory. We know that bubonic plague is caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis. We have antibiotics to treat it and public sanitation to control the rat populations that carry it. Our methods are far more sophisticated, but the core principles that emerged from the medieval world are still with us. The idea of an isolation period to see if a person develops a disease, the concept of tracing contacts and controlling borders during an epidemic. The debate over individual liberty versus the collective good. These are all echoes of the choices faced by the leaders of a terrified medieval city. They were working in the dark with no scientific knowledge to guide them. They were guided by fear, observation, and a desperate will to survive. The system they built was flawed, harsh, and based on an incorrect understanding of disease. But it was also rational, organized, and ultimately one of the first and most important steps humanity took toward bringing disease under control. The Lazaretto on its lonely island is a monument to that first organized fight against the pandemic. It stands as a testament to a time when people, faced with a catastrophe they could not understand, decided that waiting was better than dying.